It had been almost 3 years since I last stood in that house, the one that once smelled of coffee and laughter, now echoing only with the quiet hum of a ceiling fan and the creak of old wooden floors. I was 26 now, older, supposedly more grounded, yet as soon as I stepped inside, the same unease I felt as a teenager returned, that careful politeness between two people who shared a home, but never really a bond. She greeted me at the door with her usual composed smile, that same restrained warmth I'd always associated with her. My stepmother, Clara. She was 45 now, still graceful in that quiet, understated way, neatly tied hair, soft eyes that looked both tired and elegant at once. She hugged me briefly, the kind of embrace that ends before it truly begins, and said, "You've gotten taller again. Or maybe I've just gotten smaller." Dinner was waiting on the table, perfectly arranged, as if she'd spent hours trying to make everything feel right. The small gestures, the candles, the folded napkins, the matching plates, felt almost ceremonial, like she was trying to fill the air with normalcy. We talked about simple things, my work, her garden, the neighbors. Nothing that mattered, but everything that helped us avoid the silence in between. Still, the silence had its own language. There were moments when I'd glance at her and see it, the faint tension around her smile, the faraway look in her eyes when I mentioned my father. She'd stir her soup absently, pretending to listen, but her thoughts were clearly elsewhere. And then, in those tiny pauses, I realized this house wasn't empty because people had left. It was empty because something deeper, connection, laughter, love, had faded long before I returned. When she reached across the table to hand me the salt, her fingers brushed mine. Just a brief touch, soft, unintentional, but it lingered. It wasn't romantic, not even close. It was human. The kind of small contact that reminds you someone else is real, that warmth can still exist even in a room full of distance. I caught her eye for a second. She looked away quickly, her cheeks faintly flushed, though she smiled to cover it. After dinner, she offered to make tea, and I watched her move around the kitchen, graceful, practiced, yet somehow lonely. The sound of the kettle, the faint clink of porcelain cups, the scent of jasmine rising with the steam. Everything about her seemed designed to hold herself together, as though if she slowed down or sat still too long, something fragile inside her might break. When I finally said goodnight, she touched my arm, a light, motherly gesture, and said softly, "It's good to have you home, even just for a while." And for the first time in years, I heard something beneath her calm voice, a quiet longing, not for me exactly, but for the feeling of being seen again. That night, lying awake in the guest room, I realized that coming back wasn't just about visiting her. It was about facing what time had done to both of us, the years of politeness, the words never spoken, and the distance that somehow became home. The house had a way of amplifying silence at night. Every creak of the old floorboards, every sigh of wind against the windows felt louder, as if the walls themselves were remembering. I couldn't sleep. Maybe it was the strangeness of being back, or the quiet that pressed too heavily on my chest. Around midnight, I gave up on rest and wandered out of the guest room, barefoot, following the faint amber glow seeping from the living room. She was there, Clara, sitting curled up on the couch with a blanket draped around her shoulders. A book rested open in her lap, but her eyes weren't on the page. She looked lost in thought, her face softened by the lamplight. When she noticed me, she smiled, a small, weary curve of her lips. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. "Guess not," I said, leaning against the doorway. "Too quiet." She nodded knowingly. "It's funny. I used to crave quiet. Now it just feels empty." There was no bitterness in her tone, only truth, the kind that sits heavy in the air. I hesitated, then walked over and sat on the armchair beside her. The lamp threw a warm glow between us, casting shadows on her cheekbones, highlighting the fine lines near her eyes. She looked older than I remembered, but in a way that made her seem more real, less like a figure from my past, more like a person still learning how to exist. She offered me coffee, the half-finished cup she'd been nursing. I took a sip, still warm, slightly bitter. The kind of coffee meant to keep someone company, not to wake them up. We talked, hesitantly at first. About work, about how the town had changed, about small things that didn't ask too much of either of us. But slowly, the conversation drifted toward things we'd never touched before. My father, her ex-husband. The way the marriage ended quietly, not with anger, but with exhaustion. I think we both stopped trying, she said softly. And I didn't notice until it was too late. Her voice trembled slightly. I could see her eyes glisten under the lamplight, though she blinked it away quickly. I wanted to say something, anything, but words felt too clumsy for a moment like that. So I just nodded. For a while, neither of us spoke. The rain began to fall outside, tapping gently against the window panes, a rhythm that filled the silence with something almost comforting. She adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, and without thinking, I reached out to help. My fingers brushed against hers, warm and soft. She didn't pull away. "You've grown into such a kind man," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think I ever told you that." Her words caught me off guard. Compliments from her had always been polite, surface level. But this one felt honest, weighted with emotion she hadn't allowed herself before. For the first time, I looked at her not as the woman who married my father, but as a person who had built her life from silence and loss. And she, in turn, looked at me like she was seeing someone new, someone who had quietly become an adult while she wasn't watching. The rain kept falling. The clock ticked softly. And in that warm, lamplit living room, something fragile began to shift, a closeness that neither of us expected, but neither dared to name. Morning sunlight slipped quietly through the lace curtains, painting soft patterns across the living room floor. The air smelled faintly of coffee and furniture polish, the scent of order, of someone trying to keep life neatly arranged even when the heart is not. I'd offered to help Clara tidy the old study that morning, a room untouched since my father left. She hesitated before agreeing, as though opening that door might let the past rush out. The study was small, filled with books, old papers, and memories pressed into every corner. Dust clung to the spines of novels I'd never seen her read. On the desk sat a stack of envelopes, yellowed at the edges, and a glass paperweight shaped like a heart. It caught the light in a way that made me pause, a small, forgotten symbol of affection that once meant something. We worked quietly, sorting papers, folding old clothes for donation. It felt strangely intimate, two people moving in rhythm without words, sharing a silence that was no longer heavy, just full of memory. Then, as I reached into a drawer to gather some loose photographs, one slipped out of the pile and fluttered to the floor, landing face up between us. It was an old picture, the three of us. My father, Clara, and me. I couldn't have been older than 10. We were standing in front of the garden, smiling, the afternoon sunlight washing everything in gold. My father had his arm around both of us. Clara was laughing, her head tilted slightly toward him, that open, easy joy I hadn't seen on her face in years. She froze when she saw it. The color drained slightly from her cheeks, replaced by something softer, nostalgia, maybe, or sorrow disguised as a smile. "I forgot we had this," she whispered, taking the photo in her hands. Her fingers traced the edges like she was afraid it might fall apart. That was the summer before things changed. I nodded quietly. "You looked happy." "I was," she said simply. "For a while." Her eyes stayed fixed on the image, but her voice began to tremble. "You know, I always thought love was supposed to make you feel alive. But sometimes it just fades quietly. No fights, no goodbye, just silence." The words hung there between us. I didn't know what to say, only that I felt something twist inside me. Seeing her like that, vulnerable, unguarded, made me realize how little I'd truly known her all those years. She had carried her loneliness like a secret, hidden beneath grace and good manners. She smiled faintly, brushing dust off the frame. "I should have thrown these out years ago," she murmured, but she didn't. Instead, she handed it to me. "Keep it if you want. Maybe you'll remember the good parts better than I do." I looked at the photograph, her smile, the light in her eyes, the easy warmth of a time that now felt like someone else's life. "Maybe it's not about remembering perfectly," I said quietly. "Maybe it's about not letting it disappear completely." She looked up at me then, her gaze steady and filled with something unspoken, gratitude, maybe, or recognition. For the first time, it felt like she truly saw me, not as a boy who once lived in her house, but as someone who could understand her pain without needing to fix it. For a long moment, we just stood there, side by side, holding that single piece of the past between us, two people connected not by blood, but by everything time had taken away. That afternoon stretched into one of those soft, weightless days where time moved slowly and emotions hovered beneath every word. The sky outside had turned a muted gray, and the wind carried the faint scent of rain. Clara and I sat on the porch, the old swing creaking gently beneath us, a pot of tea between us cooling in the air. It had been days since we'd found that photograph, but its memory lingered quietly, not in conversation, but in how we looked at each other. The air between us wasn't awkward anymore. It was charged with something gentler, more human. She was talking about her garden, how the bougainvillea refused to bloom this year, when I noticed the light brush of tiredness beneath her eyes. There was still beauty in her face, but it was a beauty touched by time, softened by life's quiet struggles. She laughed at herself for forgetting where she planted the basil, and I couldn't help but smile. "You always had that look," I said without thinking. She turned her head slightly. "What look?" "That one," I said, gesturing faintly. "Like you're holding a secret you're too kind to tell." She chuckled, her voice warm, a little surprised. "You used to say strange things like that when you were younger." "Guess I still do," I said, smiling. The conversation drifted easily, memories, small talk, stories that revealed nothing but felt like everything. The more she spoke, the more I saw past the title of stepmother. There was a depth to her I had missed before, not because it wasn't there, but because I had never looked long enough to see it. Then, as she refilled my cup, her hand trembled slightly. I reached out instinctively to steady it, my fingers brushing against hers. The touch was brief, accidental, but it made the world feel smaller for a heartbeat. Her eyes lifted to mine, and for the first time, there was no mask, no politeness, no guardedness. Just presence. And before I could stop myself, the words slipped out. "You deserve someone who sees you the way I do." I hadn't planned to say it. I didn't even fully understand what I meant until I heard the words leave my mouth. But once spoken, they filled the air raw, uninvited, impossible to take back. Clara froze. Her lips parted slightly as if to speak, but no words came. The teacup in her hand lowered slowly to the table. For a long moment, the only sound was the swing's faint creak and the whisper of wind moving through the trees. Finally, she looked away, her voice quiet but steady. "That's a kind thing to say." Kind. The word felt too small for what I meant. But I didn't correct her. I couldn't. We sat there in silence, both of us pretending nothing had changed, though everything had. I watched her fingers trace the rim of her cup, the small rise and fall of her breath, the way she stared at the horizon as if afraid to turn back toward me. When the first drops of rain began to fall, she stood, smoothing her dress as though trying to gather her composure. "We should head inside," she said softly. I followed her, neither of us speaking. But as we walked through the doorway, I could feel the air between us, delicate, uncertain, like something fragile that had just been born and already knew it couldn't last. That night, I replayed those words in my head over and over again, realizing too late that they weren't just an accident. They were the truth I hadn't meant to reveal, the one that would change everything. The rain hadn't stopped all day. By nightfall, the air was heavy with the scent of wet soil and jasmine, the kind that seeps through open windows and settles in your chest. I couldn't sleep again. My mind kept circling back to the moment on the porch, to those words that slipped out before I could hold them back. "You deserve someone who sees you the way I do." They had hung between us since then, fragile and alive, like a secret neither of us knew how to bury. I wandered out to the porch, drawn by the soft rhythm of rain against the roof. The air was cool, damp. I sat on the wooden bench, letting the quiet wrap around me. Then I heard her voice behind me. "You shouldn't be out here. You'll catch a cold." Clara stepped into the dim light, wearing a loose cardigan over her nightdress. Her hair was slightly damp, as if she'd been standing near the window too long. She carried 2 mugs of tea, setting one beside me before sitting down. I couldn't sleep, she said. It's strange, isn't it? How the mind refuses to rest when the heart is noisy. I smiled faintly. Maybe the rain woke us both. For a while, neither of us spoke. The sound of the rain filled the pauses, steady, gentle, forgiving. The porch light cast a faint halo around her face, softening every line, every memory. Finally, I turned to her. About what I said earlier, she raised her eyes to mine. You don't have to apologize. But I should, I said. It was careless. I didn't mean to, she stopped me, her hand lifting gently in the air, her tone calm but firm. You meant it, she said softly. You just didn't expect me to hear it. Her words disarmed me. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. She looked down at her hands, fingers tracing the edge of the mug. I've spent years being polite, keeping everything in its proper place, she continued. Maybe that's why what you said startled me. Because it's been a long time since anyone has seen me. Her voice faltered on that last word. I felt something shift inside me, a tenderness so deep it scared me. I reached for her hand, hesitating just before touching it. But she didn't move away. Our fingers brushed, then settled together, gently, naturally, as if the space between them had been waiting. Clara, I said quietly. You're the only person who's ever really understood me. The words came out before I could think, but this time I didn't regret them. She looked at me, her eyes glistening with the reflection of the porch light. You shouldn't say that, she whispered. But I needed to hear it. The rain softened, turning to a mist that blurred the edges of everything around us. We sat there, 2 people bound by the same loneliness, sharing a kind of warmth that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with being seen. For a long time, she didn't let go of my hand. Neither did I. And in that quiet, rain-soaked night, I realized something simple and profound, that love, in its purest form, isn't always about possession. Sometimes it's about recognition. About knowing someone's soul when the rest of the world has forgotten them. That night, nothing more was said. Nothing more needed to be. Morning came quietly, the kind that doesn't announce itself with brightness, but with softness, pale light sliding through half-closed curtains, the faint rustle of trees outside, still damp from the rain. The world felt new, rinsed clean. But inside, something else had changed, not in a dramatic way, but in that subtle, almost imperceptible shift that follows an honest night. I woke earlier than usual, the echo of last night still sitting gently in my chest. The sound of movement came from the kitchen, the faint clatter of pans, the hum of an old radio playing something from another decade. It was comforting, familiar, human. When I stepped into the doorway, I saw her, Clara, standing by the stove, a soft gray sweater wrapped around her, hair loosely tied, sleeves rolled to her elbows. There was a small smile playing on her lips as she flipped eggs in the pan. The air was filled with the smell of butter and toast, and something about it, that simple domestic calm, made my chest ache in a way I couldn't quite name. Good morning, she said without turning. Her tone was lighter, steadier than I expected. Coffee's ready. I poured myself a cup and leaned against the counter, watching her. The morning light touched her face, catching in her hair, softening her edges. She looked peaceful, not happy, exactly, but present, and that felt like something. Neither of us mentioned the night before. There was no need. The silence between us wasn't tense anymore. It was comfortable, like 2 people who had finally stopped pretending. You always used to sleep in, she said with a quiet smile, placing a plate in front of me. Did the rain wake you up? I shook my head. Just habit, I guess. Or maybe I didn't want to miss breakfast like this. She laughed softly, that rare, musical sound I'd almost forgotten she had. It filled the kitchen in a way sunlight never could. For a while, we just ate simple food, small talk about nothing. But there was something grounding in that ordinariness, a reminder that life doesn't always need big gestures to mean something. When I reached for the jam, our hands brushed again. This time, she didn't pull away. She just smiled faintly and said, "Some things never change." When I finished, I stood to wash my plate, but she stopped me with a gentle hand on my wrist. "Leave it," she said softly. "You're a guest." Her touch lingered a moment longer than it needed to, It wasn't the kind that asks for more, it was gratitude, pure and unspoken. "I'm glad you came home," she said after a pause. "I think I needed that." I met her eyes and nodded. "Me too." The morning went on quietly, sunlight stretching across the table, the radio still humming in the background. Everything felt calm, still, but beneath it, I sensed something enduring, not romance, not longing, but connection. A truth that didn't need to be named. When I finally hugged her goodbye that afternoon, it wasn't awkward. It wasn't uncertain. It was real, warm, respectful, a moment suspended in time. She held on for just a heartbeat longer than expected, and when she let go, her eyes shone with something I understood completely: peace. As I stepped outside, I realized that what we'd shared the night before wasn't a secret to carry, it was a kind of healing. A reminder that sometimes, love's gentlest form is simply being seen and being allowed to move on in the light of morning. Life after that night didn't unfold in dramatic ways. There were no confessions, no grand reconciliations, just quiet understanding, the kind that settles between people who've finally seen each other clearly. In the weeks that followed, I went back to the rhythm of my own life, but something fundamental had shifted inside me. It was as if I'd walked out of a dense fog and could finally see the road again, not the one behind me, but the one still stretching ahead. Clara and I kept in touch, but sparingly. A text here and there, reminders about small things. "He started soccer practice today," or "the garden finally bloomed." Each message was like a soft echo of the life we once shared, reshaped into something new, lighter. I stopped expecting those messages to mean more than they did. I learned to read them for what they were: gestures of kindness, fragments of shared history, not invitations to reopen old wounds. As for Ethan, the boy who had once stood in that hallway and changed everything, he grew quieter for a while, more thoughtful. When I visited again that spring, he seemed older somehow, though only a few months had passed. He carried himself differently, less angry, more aware. We spent the afternoon fixing his bike in the driveway, the way we used to. He didn't say much, but when I handed him a wrench, he looked up and said, "I'm glad you came." It was such a simple thing, but it landed like a truth I'd been waiting to hear for years. That one sentence held forgiveness, understanding, and something else, maybe the quiet acceptance that I was still a part of his life, even if not in the way I once imagined. Driving home that evening, I thought about the word family, how people like to define it by blood, by marriage, by names on paper. But I'd come to realize it's something more fluid, something that shifts as people grow and hurt and heal. Family, I learned, is made of moments, the ones that test you and the ones that save you. Clara eventually moved to a smaller town a few hours away. She said it was for work, but I knew it was also for peace. We didn't talk much after that, but every so often, a photo would appear in my inbox, Ethan standing next to a science fair project or smiling with a trophy in his hand. Each picture told me what words didn't have to, that they were okay. That maybe we all were. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that conversation, the one that changed how I saw everything. It was never about blame or apology. It was about truth, the kind that strips you bare, but somehow leaves you whole. I used to believe that love was something that either stayed or left, but now I know it lingers in quieter ways. It transforms, reshapes itself, hides in gestures too small to notice unless you're really looking, a shared smile, a photo sent without explanation, a name saved in your phone that you never delete. The night my stepson spoke those words, I thought it was an ending. But it wasn't. It was the beginning of seeing life for what it really is: imperfect, unplanned, and sometimes unexpectedly kind. And that, I think, was enough. It's been years since that night, yet I can still hear Ethan's voice, steady but trembling, as he said those words that changed everything. They come back to me in quiet moments, on long drives, during slow mornings when the light falls softly through the curtains, or when I catch a familiar laugh in a crowd and, for a second, think it might be him. He didn't say much that evening, only a handful of words, but they carried the weight of years we'd both left unspoken. He said, "You didn't have to leave for me to love you." At the time, I didn't know how to answer. I remember standing there, the air thick with all the things we'd both lost, the home that no longer felt like mine, the bond that had frayed but somehow refused to break. His words stripped away every justification I'd built, every reason I'd told myself for walking away. In that moment, I saw not a boy who needed saving, but a young man who had found his voice and offered it to me as a gift. It took me a long time to understand what he meant. That love, real love, doesn't always look the way we expect. It doesn't demand presence or perfection. Sometimes, it survives quietly beneath distance and silence, waiting for both hearts to grow strong enough to see it for what it is. When I think of Ethan now, I don't feel the ache I once did. Instead, there's warmth, the kind that spreads slowly, the kind that feels earned. I see him as the bridge between the life I once had and the person I've become. Through him, I learned that caring for someone deeply doesn't always mean holding on. Sometimes, it means letting go with grace, trusting that what was shared will still live somewhere in both of you. As for Clara, I still remember the way she looked at me that night after Ethan spoke. There was understanding in her eyes, maybe even forgiveness. We didn't say much then either. We didn't need to. Life had already spoken for us. We had both done our best, stumbled in our own ways, and now we were learning to move forward, not as lovers or partners, but as people who once tried, and maybe that was enough. I often tell myself that we all have moments like that, moments when someone else's truth unlocks something inside us. For me, it was a boy standing in a doorway, telling me that love doesn't disappear just because life changes shape. Now, when I look back, I don't see failure. I see growth. I see a younger version of myself learning to listen, to stay, to let others speak their pain without rushing to fix it. Ethan taught me that. His words didn't just change how I saw him, they changed how I saw everything: love, family, forgiveness, even myself. And if there's one thing I know now, it's that some words don't fade. They echo quietly, persistently, guiding you long after the moment has passed. Maybe that's what love really is. Not what we say, but what stays.